Hey, Browns fans, welcome on into another episode of the Dog Check Podcast, part of the Believe Network of podcasts, and also airing weekly on Bally Sports Cleveland. Riding solo this week as we get you ready for the Browns' first preseason game coming up on Saturday against the Green Bay Packers. We have plenty to talk about there. Guys who are going to play, guys who aren't going to play. We'll get into that a little bit. But where I want to start this show is with some of the rumors and reports that have been swirling all week long in regards to the Browns and a potential trade that they're pursuing. So we'll go there first, but I do want to first remind you as well to like, follow, subscribe, and comment, whatever you need to do to interact with the podcast. We appreciate you guys doing so. We obviously are part of the Believe Network of podcasts, and you can find us anywhere on any of your podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It's all available to you. So along those lines, though, we have had a busy week in terms of these potential trade rumors. And what's interesting about the situation is, earlier in the offseason, Brandon Aiyuk, it was almost like a foregone conclusion he was going to end up a Pittsburgh Steeler. And there was all these different, just links to why that was going to happen, why he was going to end up in Pittsburgh. There was, I know at one point he did like an Instagram live where he was wearing a Pittsburgh Pirates hat and everyone was reading the tea leaves on that. So it's been kind of this ongoing process for several months since it was basically realized that, that the 49ers weren't going to pay him or give him the extension that he's looking for as he enters the last year of his rookie deal. And because of that, it's opened up this door to other teams now trying to pursue him and being open to obviously adding him or making a trade for him. And yeah, like it's crazy how it's kind of divulged to where we are. And like before this week, the conversation was largely based in this idea of like, well, hey, if he's available, why maybe the Browns should make a play. But I don't know that until this week we really had a lot of reporting done on whether or not the Browns were actually in on some sort of Brandon Aiyuk deal. It was more so just us as, I think, fans of the team, those who are around the team and cover the team, sort of saying, hey, maybe a good option for them. And this is the first week now where you were getting actual reporting from, I know, NBC Sports Bay Area, that the Brandon Aiyuk situation had basically become down or gotten down to four different teams at the time. And then it got even further down to just the two teams, which was Cleveland and the New England Patriots. And then in recent days since, the Steelers have obviously kind of gotten back into the mix. It sounded like, Pittsburgh was in for a while and then maybe wasn't going to meet the asking price that San Francisco was asking for. So they dropped out, then they come back in. And so I think the important thing to remember with the situation is that's all very fluid. Nothing that I'm talking about right now is like confirmed. There's nothing that says, Brandon Aiyuk is a Cleveland Brown at this point, or that he's a Pittsburgh Steeler and he's not a Cleveland Brown. So it's all very up in the air. It sounds like the 49ers are sort of slow playing this thing, but it's now a reality that we get a chance to sort of sit back and think about and discuss, and specifically what it could mean for the Browns going into 2024, which is where I want to start. We can talk about the Pittsburgh angle of this if he does end up there, and we most definitely will do those things. But I do think that from the Browns side of things, I understand why there's sort of mixed feelings on what a potential trade for Brandon Aiyuk would look like, including the fact that it would likely mean Amari Cooper is shipped to San Francisco as part of this deal. And so, yes, all that stuff matters. And I understand, like, he's a fan favorite here, and people have their, reservations about maybe making this trade because of that. Now, I want to start with why it makes sense. I said, dating back to the Amari Cooper holdout during minicamp, that I just wasn't sure how much the Browns, I should say, really wanted to pay a wide receiver who was going to be entering his 30s. And that's what you now have in Amari Cooper. That's not an easy thing. Like, it's a tough dilemma because there have been some receivers recently who have gotten paid and, have in their 30s, and they're still performing at a pretty high level. So it's not necessarily something that's completely, never. It's not completely rare. It does happen, but I do think like you got to be careful with those types of things. And we know that the age of 30 just is almost this red flag for teams in terms of signing guys. Because once you get beyond that age, you start to worry about deterioration and how much money you're putting into a guy that in 2 or 3 years might not be the same player. And so I questioned that. I did. I wondered how inclined the Browns were to do something like that. And I think they told you with the way that Amari Cooper deal got settled, that they weren't necessarily, gung-ho about the idea of paying a guy into his 30, or that was going to be turning 30 that turned 30 this summer. I don't know that for sure, but those, reading the tea leaves, that's what that feels like when instead of giving them an extension, which they've given other guys extensions, their decision ended up being, well, hey, let's just rework your current deal, the last year of your current deal, where it all becomes guaranteed, $20 million guaranteed for this season, and we'll add $5 million in incentives to kind of boost it a little bit and give you a little extra added bonus money. So when you get to a final deal like that, that to me screams, okay, maybe they don't want to pay a wide receiver going into his age 30 season and beyond because they just worry about deterioration and what that's going to look like. And so they'd rather invest that money elsewhere. Now, how this relates to a Brandon Aiyuk is that Brandon Aiyuk is, in a lot of ways, he's Amari Cooper 4 years younger. He's 26. He actually does a lot more in an offense than what Amari Cooper does. And the reason I say he's like basically Amari Cooper, but maybe not fully Amari Cooper, is that I would say Amari Cooper is one of the best, if not the best, route runner in football. And I don't know that he does that quite as crisp as Amari Cooper, but he still is a really, really good route runner in his own right. So it's not like you're taking a massive step back there or anything. And so I've been saying for a while now, trading for Brandon Aiyuk would make so much sense for the Cleveland Browns. It truly, truly would, because you get younger at the position at a number one wide receiver spot. You also just traded for, obviously, Jerry Jeudy this offseason, and then gave him an extension of his own. And when you do something like that, obviously he's only 25, so he's, even a year younger than what Aiyuk is. But you do something like that, and it's kind of signaling like, hey, we're trying to get young at this position and move forward with those guys as kind of the focal point of our passing game. And I think Brandon Aiyuk falls obviously completely into that billing, where it's like, let's get another young guy in here, get him on an extension, because that's part of these negotiations is if you're going to trade for him, he gets to work out an extension with that team, and then see how it all kind of comes together with a young wide receiving core that you're hoping has a chance to just kind of be there for the future, and you don't have to worry about that position so much anymore. I think that makes a ton of sense. And it's twofold, because again, you're getting a really good player on top of it, but you're also getting a player who's younger that can fill that role, fill that void at wide receiver that this team has kind of struggled to draft. And you feel really good about your group after that. And you kind of, just ignore it. You don't have to necessarily address that as much in the draft. And I think there's also an angle of this too, where, you think about this is going to be the first year coming up next year that the Browns have a first round pick since the 2021 season or 2021 offseason, I should say. And what areas could they be looking at? Well, I think there's two. Wide receiver could be one if you're not bringing Amari Cooper back. And again, he's only young. He's playing in the last year of his deal. And I think left tackle could be the other one if Jedrick Wills doesn't get his what together and start performing at a level that the Browns feel is satisfactory to being that cornerstone left tackle. So this, it alleviates, if you can get Brandon Aiyuk and get him locked up, it alleviates you having to pay Jedrick Wills money that you don't necessarily think he might be worth. It alleviates the search for a wide receiver. You can kind of, again, place it and forget it. You don't have to think about addressing that position as a higher priority on your list, because you have it taken care of. And then you maybe can use that first round pick next year on a new left tackle. Again, if Jedrick Wills doesn't prove this year that he's maybe the guy that you want to invest in long term. So I think it's all very interesting. And I do think it makes a lot of sense for the Browns from a number of different angles. From a football sense, it makes a ton of sense. You get younger, You get Deshaun Watson, another great weapon that again is 4 years younger. And just from a sense of like doing the math on the future and the direction of this team, trying to keep that championship window that we believe this Browns team is in open, a move like that does that for you. So I've never had a problem with the concept behind making a trade. Now, do I love the idea of giving up Amari Cooper if that's what it has to be? Not as much. Amari Cooper has become a cornerstone player on this team, a cornerstone player in this offense. He's a leader on this team. I know he doesn't talk much. He's kind of a quiet guy. He doesn't, go out. He's not this boisterous. He's different in that way because we know about so many different wide receivers that are like that. That they give you that diva personality. Stephon Diggs in Buffalo last year had some. It seemed like his ego kind of got the best of him, and he got ran out of town there. You had here in Cleveland, Odell Beckham Jr. and everything that brought the years that he was here. There's so many different wide receivers you can look around this league that do sort of bring that to the table, and it sometimes can be a problem in the locker room, be a problem within a team dynamic. You don't have that with Amari Cooper. He is as pretty much straight and narrow as they come, very humble for the most part, and he just kind of goes about his business. He shows up with his lunch pail and he goes to work, which that mentality Browns fans love. It's the same sort of thing that we talk about with Nick Chubb, which is why those are two of your favorite Browns players that exist. It's very Cleveland. And so, yeah, like there's something to be said for losing a guy like Amari Cooper if that's what it would take to pull this deal off. That is 100% true. And you hate to lose that in the locker room, but I think what you gain from a football standpoint, and again, a roster building standpoint for the future, outweighs that. Because at the end of the day, guys, the Browns have talked a ton about their culture and about how since Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry came in, they have been able to sort of reset the expectation here, the culture here, the vibes here, and knowing that the culture isn't just about one guy. Like it doesn't revolve around just Amari Cooper. And so, yeah, like losing him would stink, but the guys that you have around this team and in place, not even just the coach and GM, but within the roster, there's a bunch of guys that came back this year because they loved the vibes last year and they wanted to continue to be a part of that. So Darius Smith is a great example of that. Re-signed with the Browns because he felt like A, they had unfinished business, and B, because he liked the vibes here. Maurice Hurst, another defensive lineman, said similar things. So I think like that culture that it survives losing Amari Cooper if that's what this were to come to. Now, we don't know if it's going to get done. We don't know if it's going to happen, and that's okay. But I do, from my perspective, I think it makes a ton of sense for the Browns to pursue this. And the best part is, if it doesn't happen, guess what? You have like the consummate pro in that room in Amari Cooper, who you just, you're going out to battle with this season. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. Like he's still a great receiver playing at a high level in this league. It's not like you're sweating losing Amari because of this. It's not like if you miss out on Brandon Aiyuk, it's not like you have to cry over it because you still have a really good player here in the building. And he's the one guy that, despite maybe being linked to rumors and all these different things, he isn't going to hold that against the organization, and he isn't going to let that become, some distraction. He's just going to go out and work. Like that's just what he does. He understands, and he talked about this in his first press conference he had when he returned to the team at the start of training camp. That was one of his big points. Was like, I get it's part of the business, and you just kind of roll with it, and I don't pay much attention to it, and I'm here to work. So you have the one guy who maybe is totally locked in on just focusing on the football. And I think that matters in the context of this situation too, because if you miss out on Aiyuk, I don't think he's going to sweat that as much as maybe other players or maybe some of these other diva wide receivers would. Now, in terms of like needing it to happen, what's interesting about this is the Browns don't necessarily need it to happen because they do have Amari Cooper. The other team that seems to be gaining the most traction in terms of him coming there is the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Browns' biggest rival, of course. And they, it seems like, are more desperate to have this deal happen because, like their wide receiver room isn't quite as good. It's basically George Pickens, who I actually think is a really good player, and I like his game, and Van Jefferson's like the next man up, right? So it feels like they need Brandon Aiyuk more than the Browns do. And so that's why it seems like they've been so heavily linked to that to a deal, and why they were out at one point and then got back in. And there's also the side of this where it's like, well, maybe each of these teams is using the other as leverage. Like, are the Steelers using the Browns as leverage to try to basically, or are the 49ers using the Browns as leverage to try to, leverage the Steelers? Are the Steelers doing the same with the Browns? Are the Browns doing the same with the Steelers in terms of trying to drive the price up by being like, hey, well, we're interested in Brandon Aiyuk too. We're willing to offer this, and if they have the best package, but Brandon Aiyuk maybe doesn't want to go to Cleveland because it sounds like that's what things are kind of waiting on, is him to decide like where he's comfortable playing and what he wants to do in terms of a contract and the logistics of all that. But in the same vein, whether all that's happening or not is obviously out of our control. But it's been a fascinating story to follow, and we'll maybe never know the full story of what's going on behind the scenes. But at some point, I do expect this to kind of come to fruition, figure itself out, and from there, we'll just have to kind of see what everything looks like in terms of where he ends up, if he's in a Browns uniform, if he's in a Steelers uniform, and be on our merry way in terms of what that means for the season. But obviously, if you're a Browns fan, you don't want to see Brandon Aiyuk end up on Pittsburgh, which is another reason why, if for nothing else, maybe that's why you try to go get this player. And if you're that close anyway, you give a little extra to get it done because you feel like you're keeping a rival from getting him and locking him up long term. Instead of that, the alternative is you get that guy and you get to lock him up long term. How do you feel about the possibility of a Brandon Aiyuk trade and him coming to Cleveland? Is it something you're on board with? Or given that there's reports that Amari Cooper would be part of the deal, are you more inclined to just run or roll out with Amari Cooper and forget about Brandon Aiyuk altogether? Where do you stand on it? I'm curious your thoughts. You can hit me up on X at Spencito_. And of course, follow us as always as part of the Believe Network podcast. We are the Dog Check Podcast, and you can find us everywhere you get your podcast, and of course on Bally Sports Cleveland. I want to pivot as you get ready for the first preseason game of the year for the Browns, Saturday against the Green Bay Packers. We know that Deshaun Watson is not expected to play. I don't know that is surprising news, but it was interesting news because now you start to look ahead on the schedule and wonder, okay, is he going to play in the preseason at all? And I think it's an interesting debate specific to Deshaun. And I'll just say this, like most years, I'm the person saying, put your stars in bubble wrap. I don't need to see Denzel Ward out there. I don't necessarily need to see, I don't need to see Myles Garrett out there. If this was Deshaun from the Texans during that time, and he'd just been drafted by the Browns, let's say, I probably wouldn't need to see him out there. But this is Deshaun after the Texans, after a year off, after the off the field stuff, after the suspension, after the shoulder injury. And so I'm at a point right now where I'm thinking the opposite for Deshaun Watson, where I want to see him play in games, even, non games that don't matter in terms of like your record, exhibition games that are in the preseason, because I need to see him get snaps. I need to see him take reps. You can only simulate that so much in practice. I understand like reps are reps, everything helps. I'm not denying that. But you can only do so much in practice that feels like a real game. And I want to see Deshaun take as many snaps during the preseason as possible to get himself ready for a season that has massive implications for him. And frankly, just to make sure, like, he has a history, by the way, of getting off to slow starts in the season. We saw that last year. Didn't look good in the Bengals game. Took him like 3 weeks to really look like a really good player. And then he got hurt, and then it was all downhill from there. And even though he had a couple solid performances mixed in there as well. But I need to try to get out all the quote-unquote rust as possible and get him out on the field so that he's as close to ready as he can be when the season starts. I understand it's the preseason. These games don't matter. You don't want to get anybody hurt. I think it makes sense why the Browns are doing this because it's all part of their process, right? His recovery from the shoulder injury and the shoulder surgery, they don't want to rush him back out there. They're playing it safe, and I can totally understand that perspective. But I look at it, take a step back. And I'm looking ahead and I'm like, well, I kind of want to see him play because I need to know that there's no. Here's the other thing. I mentioned rust. We've spent the last 2 years talking about rust with Deshaun at the start of each season. It was, well, he's rusty. He hasn't played in a while, this and that. I'm not doing that anymore. We watched last year Joe Flacco come in, and 12 weeks he spent or 11 to 12 weeks, somewhere in that range. He spent on his couch watching football and practicing with his kids in his yard. And he comes out, and first game he plays for the Browns, he's gunning it down the field, and he's throwing it all over the yard. And then he does that over the course of 5 games, gets the Browns into the playoffs, and it's like, where did this come from? Small sample size, I get it. But if we saw Joe Flacco do something like that, I'm done with the whole rust thing with Deshaun. Like, I'm not doing that. And I'm not trying to make this a Deshaun versus Joe Flacco thing. That's not the point. The point for me is simply that we've done the rust thing the last 2 years, and we try to give him the benefit of the doubt on that. Even me, like I've had no problem with saying that there was probably he needed some room to kind of adjust to a new situation, get his sea legs back underneath him and all those different things. Fine. But year 3, I understand the shoulder injury is now a factor as well. I'm not doing that though anymore. Like I am so past this idea of, well, he just needs to shake off the rust and get himself right, and it takes some time. Like, no, I want to see Deshaun hit the ground running week 1. And for me, in order for him to do that, he needs to take as many reps as possible in the preseason. You might disagree with me, and that's fine. I need to see him out there and to be clear, like, I'm not saying put him out there with the second offensive line or the third offensive line. No, if the first offensive line's playing, I think it's fair to put him out there. If they're not, okay, fine. But I need to see him take as many reps as possible. I need to see him go out and throw the football around so I can get a sense of, like, okay, where's the shoulder at in real game situations? I need him to experience those real game situations as closely as possible. They can be mimicked, and the preseason is the closest thing you get to that during this time of year. So as far as I'm concerned, I think he should play. And now I'm starting to wonder when he will play, because if he's not playing in the first preseason game number 2, you're going to get the joint practices leading up to that with the Vikings before the game that they actually play. And so the Browns are going to treat that like a preseason. And I can respect that. That is kind of a simulated game in its own right. They treat them that way. So fine. But then that leaves one preseason game. And last year, Kevin Stefanski did play a number of the starters, including Deshaun, in that third preseason game. So we'll see if he has that strategy again. But you run out of you miss an opportunity here to get Deshaun out there to sort of start getting himself adjusted for the start of the season. Because I'm telling you, if he starts slow again, I am not coming back to this and revisiting the whole like rust thing, give him time. And no, he's had plenty of time. He's had lots of time. And he's got to be out there, in my opinion, taking as many reps as possible to get himself as close to game ready as he can be. And I think that happens during the preseason game, even though we like to marginalize the preseason and act like it's not this important thing whatsoever. Do you need to see Deshaun Watson play in the preseason? What are your thoughts on that? Again, you can hit me up on X at Spencito_. Final thing I want to get to before I get out of here for the week, guys, and it's going to be a quick rundown here of the 5 things, maybe not even 5, but just a list of things that I am going to be watching in this first preseason matchup with the Green Bay Packers. Details that I think matter in terms of roster battles and what could play out here through the rest of camp in the preseason. And I start at the quarterback position with what happens in the third and fourth quarterback spots right now. We know Deshaun's not playing. Jameis Winston's going to start the game. He'll get a good amount of time. And then we move on down the depth chart where you have Dorian Thompson-Robinson and Tyler Huntley. Last few days of camp leading up to this game, Dorian Thompson-Robinson was the first guy up to take those third-team reps. We'll see if that continues in this preseason game or if it's back the other way with Huntley sort of taking those reps first. But those two guys are going to rotate, and so I'm curious to see kind of how that plays out. Along the lines of the offense, I am fascinated to see Ken Dorsey's the touch points of Ken Dorsey's offense woven into Kevin Stefanski's system that we've seen throughout camp, but I'm excited to see it in more of a game setting. What's it all going to look like? The motion, keep an eye out for the motion. and just some of the different wrinkles, the RPO type stuff that they might utilize as well. What is all that going to look like in a game setting is going to be fascinating to watch as well. So I'll have my eye on that. And then also on the offensive side, I'm really interested to see Cedric Tillman and what he does this preseason, because there's been a lot of talk about him becoming that next great receiver and maybe finally a receiver that they hit on in the draft for the Browns. And he's had a really good camp. And I want to see it now, again, in a game setting, what he brings to the table. And if he has a really big camp, if he has a good camp and a good preseason, couples those two things together, I am fascinated and curious what that means when we get to roster cut down day on August 28th in terms of Elijah Moore. Like, could he actually supersede Elijah Moore and take his spot on the depth chart as that third wide receiver up on this team? So that could play out in real time based on how these preseason games go. On the defensive side, I'm going to be watching the linebackers and the rotation there, especially with some guys banged up. Also, the DB rotation with Greg Newsome down. There was a little bit of practice of Grant Delpit becoming sort of the slot guy with Rodney McLeod and Juan Thornhill serving as the two back-end safeties. And I found that kind of interesting. So just kind of how they work that on nickel in the nickel formation. And the last thing I'll give you, of course, and this is an obvious one this time of year, your rookies. What are the rookies doing? Jamari Thrash and Nathaniel Watson in particular, the linebacker and the wide receiver that they got. Mike Hall Jr., who's a big deal as their second-round pick. Zach Zinter's going to play in this game, so we'll see what he brings to the table. But yeah, all those guys will be must watch, because we're trying to see where they fit and if they're going to make this team, obviously. And so that's another good one. And I actually just thought of another one, last one. The new kickoff. It's funny, Bubba Ventrone back in the spring said he thought you might actually see some of what teams are thinking with this play this time of year, just because they got to iron some things out. But then he kind of reverted course this week and said he actually doesn't think you're going to see much at all. So I don't think we're going to see a ton, but anytime we get a chance to see this play in action and dissect it a little bit more is a lot of fun. So those are the things I'm going to be watching for against the Packers on Saturday. What are you going to be watching for? Let me know on X at @Spencito_. And as always, I do want to remind you guys that I appreciate your viewership, your listenership to the Dog Check Podcast. We are part of the Believe network of podcasts. And also, we air weekly on Bally Sports Cleveland. We will be back next week with likely 2 episodes. We're getting close to the regular season. I want to start doing a little bit more. I want to interact with you guys a little bit more. We want to do a mailbag type deal. So we're getting into all those different things and rolling with some different ideas that I am excited to bring to the show and bring to you guys, the fans of this team. So stay tuned for all that. But I'm excited about it. We'll have preseason football to talk about. And until next time, thanks again for watching, and go Browns.